The courtroom was filled with a tension so thick it felt suffocating. Every eye in the room was focused on one man, Richard Whitmore, the billionaire, the genius, the titan of industry. He sat in his chair, arms crossed, a smug smile plastered on his face. He refused to stand when the judge entered, dismissing the norms of the courtroom with an air of arrogance. Judge Clara Johnson, young, brilliant, and the first black woman to hold the prestigious position, sat calmly behind the bench, her eyes fixed on him. Her expression was unreadable, betraying nothing of her thoughts as she regarded Whitmore's defiant posture. Mr. Whitmore, her voice was smooth yet firm as she addressed him. In my courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters. Whitmore scoffed loudly, leaning back in his chair as he shot a condescending glance at the judge. Not today, he replied, his voice dripping with disdain. Not for you. Gasps filled the room and a ripple of unease washed over the gallery. Even the security guards shifted uncomfortably. The lawyers exchanged nervous glances. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment. This was a high-profile trial and the world was watching. Clara Johnson didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head as if she was observing an intricate puzzle she had already solved. Without breaking eye contact, she reached for her gavel. Bam! The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, commanding the room's attention. All rise! Her voice rang out again, sharper this time. The bailiffs began to move toward Whitmore, their expressions tense. Lawyers whispered among themselves, the tension in the room rising. But Whitmore didn't seem concerned. His smirk widened as if he had won, believing he had succeeded in putting the judge in her place. He had no idea what was coming next. Clara Johnson's gaze never wavered. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the bench, her brown eyes locking onto his with unshakable resolve. Mr. Whitmore, she began, her voice calm yet cold, sending a chill down the spine of everyone in the room. You seem to be under the impression that this courtroom belongs to you, that these rules don't apply to you, that I don't apply to you. Whitmore chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. That's one way to put it, he muttered dismissively. Clara Johnson's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, as if she had seen this all before. The uniformed officer stepped forward, and with unwavering authority she said, Yes, Your Honor, remove Mr. Whitmore from my courtroom now. The smug smile on Whitmore's face vanished in an instant. What? He barked, rising to his feet. You heard me, Clara responded, her voice as steady as ever. Remove him. He can watch the proceedings from a holding cell. A wave of gasps rippled through the room. Defense attorneys jumped to their feet, voices overlapping in frantic protest. Your Honor, that's completely unnecessary. You can't do that. Whitmore's voice, once laced with arrogance, now dripped with outrage. You can't do this, he shouted, but Clara Johnson ignored him, her gaze unwavering. Mr. Whitmore has made it clear he does not respect this court, she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He will be held in contempt and removed until he is ready to behave like an adult. The two officers moved forward, their steps heavy and resolute. Whitmore jerked back in his seat, his face turning crimson with fury. You touch me and I'll sue you for this, he threatened, but the officers remained unfazed. As one of the officers grabbed his arm, Whitmore reacted violently, pushing a chair aside with a loud scrape. He spun toward the officers, his face a mask of rage. I dare you to lay another hand on me, he shouted, his voice thick with contempt. But Clara Johnson remained motionless, watching the scene unfold like it was something she had witnessed 100 times before. The bailiffs were unbothered by his tantrum. They had dealt with far worse, gang leaders, violent offenders, and career criminals. A spoiled billionaire throwing a hissy fit was nothing new. When Whitmore swung at one of the officers, he made a critical mistake. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The bailiffs moved swiftly, their trained movements precise and efficient. One grabbed Whitmore's arm, twisting it behind his back, while the other forced him forward over the desk, pinning him to the surface. Papers went flying, and Whitmore's expensive watch clattered onto the floor. Get off me, Whitmore screamed, struggling wildly, his suit crumpling under the force of the officer's hold. Do you know who I am? He bellowed. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence. A few reporters scribbled furiously into their notepads, capturing every moment. The cameras clicked, immortalizing the downfall of a man who once ruled the business world. Richard Whitmore, the trillionaire, the untouchable king of Wall Street, was being dragged out of the courtroom like a common criminal. Clara Johnson, unmoved by the spectacle, leaned back in her chair. She said nothing as they took him. She didn't need to. The echoes of Whitmore's roars reverberated down the hallway as the doors swung shut behind him. The silence that followed in the courtroom was heavy, almost palpable. The world had just witnessed something unprecedented. Clara Johnson turned her gaze back to the stunned courtroom, her expression calm. "Shall we proceed?" she asked, her voice steady and unyielding. Clara Johnson took a deep breath as she stepped into her office, closing the door behind her. The weight of the day hung heavy on her shoulders. The trial with Richard Whitmore had been unlike any she had faced before. She had dealt with arrogant billionaires, men who thought they could bend the law to their will. But Whitmore was different. He wasn't just throwing a tantrum. He was a man who believed the world was his to control, and that included her courtroom. But Clara had put him in his place, much to the astonishment of everyone watching. She walked over to her desk and flipped through the case files. The evidence against Whitmore was damning. His empire, Whitmore Global Holdings, was built on a foundation of corruption, fraud, and money laundering. Lives had been ruined, millions had been stolen, and Whitmore had continued to laugh in the face of those he exploited. But now, for the first time in his life, someone had dared to stand up to him. Her fingers tightened around the papers. The events of the day replayed in her mind. The courtroom had been on edge, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Whitmore, sitting there with his smug grin, refusing to stand when she entered the room, had underestimated her. His arrogance had gotten the better of him, and now it was biting back. He thought he could manipulate his way out of this. But Clara was no ordinary judge, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. She heard a knock on the door, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, and Daniel Cooper, her trusted clerk, stepped in. "Judge, you need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. Clara turned to face him, a frown forming on her face. "What is it?" He handed her a tablet, and she glanced at the screen. Her stomach tightened as she read the headlines flashing across the screen. Judge Clara Johnson under fire. Conflict of interest allegations surface. She scrolled through the article. It claimed that she had a personal vendetta against Whitmore, accusing her of bias due to her past rulings involving corrupt businessmen. A chill ran down her spine as she saw the allegations against her gaining traction in the media. "They're spinning it," Daniel said, his voice low. "Whitmore's people are turning the narrative. They're making you out to be the villain." Clara sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She had known this was coming. Whitmore was powerful, and he wasn't about to lose without a fight. But she wasn't going to let him manipulate the public or the system. "I've dealt with worse," she muttered under her breath. "But this is different." Daniel watched her closely. "What do you want to do?" She set the tablet down on the desk and met his gaze. "I'm not backing down. This is bigger than me. This is about justice. If they think they can intimidate me with lies, they're mistaken." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Are you sure they're going to escalate this? They're already calling for you to step down from the case." "I'm not stepping down," Clara said firmly, her eyes hardening, "and I'm not going to let Whitmore control this narrative. We'll expose him for who he really is. Let the world see what he's done." As she spoke, Clara felt a surge of determination rise within her. She had worked too hard to let someone like Richard Whitmore tear down everything she had built. He may have money, but she had the law on her side, and she wasn't about to let him win. Back in the holding cell, Whitmore paced angrily. His lawyers had tried to visit him again, but he had thrown them out. He didn't want to hear their useless advice about playing nice. They had underestimated Clara, and now he was trapped in this small, cold cell. But Whitmore was used to controlling everything, and he wasn't about to let this woman get the best of him. His fingers drummed against the metal table as he thought about his next move. He had always believed that money could solve any problem, but this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about his freedom, his reputation, and his empire. Clara Johnson had humiliated him in front of the world, but he wasn't going to let it end like this. He needed to remind her who was in charge. With a dark smile, he leaned back against the wall, a plan already forming in his mind. It was time to call in a favor. He picked up the phone and dialed a number. When the line connected, he spoke in a low, controlled voice. It's time. Make sure she understands who she's dealing with. The door creaked open, snapping Clara Johnson out of her thoughts. Her clerk, Vanessa Reynolds, stepped in, holding up a tablet. Clara frowned, sensing something was off. What is it? She asked, her tone sharp. Vanessa handed her the tablet, and Clara's heart skipped a beat when she saw the headlines filling the screen. Richard Whitmore was trending, not because of his courtroom meltdown, but because of her. The words jumped out at her like a punch to the gut. Rogue judge humiliates billionaire, abuse of power. Followed by Richard Whitmore denied basic rights in courtroom chaos. Judge Clara Johnson goes too far. Is this about race? Clara's grip on the tablet tightened. She had been expecting backlash. She knew Whitmore had connections, power, and influence. But this was faster and fiercer than she had anticipated. The story was already spreading, and now she was being painted as the villain, accused of racial bias and power hunger. They're spinning it against you, Vanessa said quietly, her voice tinged with concern. Clara exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Her heart pounded, but her face remained composed. She placed the tablet down and locked eyes with Vanessa. Schedule a meeting with the Chief Justice, she said, her voice firm. Now. Vanessa hesitated. You think they're going to— I don't know, Clara admitted, a shadow passing over her expression. But I need to be ready, because this isn't just a trial anymore. It's a war, and Whitmore just made me his next target. Clara sat across from Chief Justice James Wilson, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. The walls of his office were lined with law books, the air thick with the scent of leather and freshly brewed coffee. She had been in this room many times, but never like this. James Wilson placed a newspaper in front of her, the headline glaring at her. We have a problem, he said calmly. Clara didn't flinch. She had already seen the headlines, already read the twisted version of the story being pushed by Whitmore's people. They were painting her as biased, a power-hungry activist, and some outlets even went as far as to suggest she had racially targeted Whitmore. It was absurd, dangerous, but she had expected this. I followed the law, Clara said, her voice steady, though her jaw tightened with frustration. He refused to stand. He refused to respect the court. Wilson leaned forward, rubbing his temples. I don't disagree with your decision, Clara, but you need to understand something. Whitmore is not just another defendant. He has power, influence, and right now he's using every bit of it to turn this case into a public spectacle. Clara's stomach clenched. She could feel the weight of the media's eyes on her, but she didn't let it show. So what are you saying? She asked, her voice cold. Wilson sighed, his expression serious. I'm saying that if this continues, the Judicial Committee may start asking questions. They may push to have you removed from the case. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Whitmore wanted that. That was his game. He wasn't just fighting the case in court, he was fighting it in the media, turning the world against her. And now he was trying to remove her from the very case that could destroy him. Are you telling me to step down? Clara's voice was icy, her gaze never leaving his. Wilson shook his head. Not yet, but you need to be careful. Do not give him any more ammunition. Clara exhaled slowly. She understood. But inside, she was already planning her next move. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a battle for everything she had worked for. Meanwhile, Richard Whitmore leaned back in his private holding cell, a lazy smirk on his face as he watched the news on the small screen mounted to the wall. The media was doing exactly what he wanted. They were dissecting Clara's history, questioning her rulings, and turning her into the problem. This was only step one. Step two was breaking her completely. The cell door opened, and Jonathan Reeves, Whitmore's lead attorney, stepped inside. His face was tight with concern. Looks like your little PR stunt worked, Reeves said, crossing his arms. They're already talking about getting her removed. Whitmore chuckled. Did you really think I was going to sit in here and let her embarrass me? Reeves didn't smile. Brandon, you need to be careful. You're winning the media war, but in the courtroom, she still has the power. Whitmore's smirk didn't waver. Not for long, he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Reeves hesitated, clearly unsure of Whitmore's plan. What are you planning? Whitmore stood, adjusting his suit. Oh, nothing, and he said casually, but his eyes gleamed with something dark. just making sure Judge Clara Johnson remembers her place. That night, Clara arrived at her driveway, exhausted but determined. The meeting with Chief Justice James Wilson had only solidified what she already knew. Whitmore was trying to intimidate her, but she wasn't afraid of him. She had faced worse. As she stepped out of her car, the crisp night air filled her lungs. The neighborhood was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows over the pavement. She walked up to her front door, her mind racing with everything she needed to do next. And then she saw it. A single white envelope was tucked into her doorframe. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting any mail. Frowning, she pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 4 words written in bold black ink. Step down or else. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She slowly looked around, scanning the dark street, the parked cars, the quiet houses. Nothing. No one. But someone had been here. Someone had left this threat. Her hands tightened around the note. Whitmore. It had to be him. He was playing dirty. Clara inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't the kind of woman who backed down. If Whitmore wanted a war, he had just started one. Clara Johnson stepped into the courthouse, her jaw set in a tight line as the flood of reporters closed in. Their questions rang out like gunfire. Judge Johnson, do you have a response to the allegations? Are you biased against Richard Whitmore? Are you going to step down from the case? She ignored them, keeping her gaze forward. She had dealt with media pressure before, but this was different. This wasn't just about the case anymore. Whitmore had escalated it into an all-out war, one that wasn't being fought in the courtroom alone, but in the court of public opinion. As she reached the courtroom doors, Vanessa Reynolds, her clerk, rushed up to her, her face pale. "Judge," she said breathlessly, "you need to see this." Clara took a deep breath and stepped into her chambers, shutting the door behind them. Vanessa handed her a tablet, and Clara's stomach dropped. The headlines were worse than she had imagined. Judge Clara Johnson, conflict of interest, hidden bias against the wealthy. Did she target Whitmore for personal reasons? Calls for removal grow as Judge Johnson faces scrutiny. Clara's fingers curled around the device, her grip so tight her knuckles turned white. This wasn't just a smear campaign. This was strategic. Whitmore was weaponizing the media against her, setting the stage for a formal motion to have her removed from the case. Vanessa shifted uneasily. "It's everywhere, Judge. News outlets are running with it. People are talking about it online. Even some legal analysts are saying this could force me off the case." Clara finished for her, her voice tight. Vanessa hesitated. "Chief Justice Wilson is waiting for you." Chief Justice James Wilson leaned back in his chair as Clara sat across from him. He had been her mentor early in her career, a man she had deeply respected. But today, his expression was unreadable. He tapped his fingers against the newspaper on his desk, the same headline she had just read moments ago. "We have a problem, Clara," he said, his voice grave. "I followed the law," Clara said evenly. "Whitmore refused to stand, refused to respect the court." Wilson sighed, rubbing his temple. "I don't disagree with how you handled it, but you need to understand something. Whitmore isn't just another corrupt billionaire on trial. He has influence, and he's using every bit of it." Clara's jaw tightened. "Are you telling me to step down?" Wilson shook his head. "Not yet, but the Judicial Committee is watching this closely. If this media storm keeps growing, they may push for your removal." Clara exhaled slowly, nodding. She had suspected this was his endgame. Whitmore wasn't trying to win in court. He was trying to remove the one person who could hold him accountable. In his private holding cell, Richard Whitmore leaned back, smirking as he watched the news unfold. The media frenzy was everything he had hoped for. Every headline chipped away at Clara's credibility, painting her as the real problem. Sitting across from him, his new lawyer, Henry Crawford, flipped through documents, unimpressed. "You're enjoying this too much," he muttered. Whitmore chuckled. "She thought she could embarrass me. I'm just returning the favor." Crawford adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Careful, Richard. You might be winning in the media, but the courtroom is still hers." "Not for long," Whitmore said smoothly. Crawford hesitated before speaking again. "I did some digging. Clara Johnson isn't just a judge. She has connections, Federal prosecutors, law enforcement, even political figures. Whitmore's smirk faltered slightly. So? She's not just fighting for her reputation, Crawford said. She's fighting to make an example out of you. A flicker of something crossed Whitmore's face, something close to unease. It was the first time since this trial had started that he felt the faintest sense of vulnerability. He didn't like it. Then we hit her harder, he said coldly. Crawford hesitated. Richard, I don't care what it takes. I want her gone. The next morning, Clara stepped out of her car, moving quickly through the courthouse entrance. She had barely made it inside when Vanessa ran up to her again. Judge, we have a new development, she said urgently. Clara frowned. What now? Vanessa handed her another document. As Clara read, her blood ran cold. Whitmore's legal team had filed a formal motion for her recusal from the case. And this time they had evidence. Fabricated evidence. It claimed she had financial ties to businesses affected by Whitmore's empire. It alleged conflicts of interest, even suggesting past rulings had favored companies that were his competitors. Worst of all, an anonymous source had come forward, someone claiming she had personally sought to bring him down. Clara's stomach churned. She had seen Whitmore's tactics before, but this was next level. She lifted her gaze, her mind already calculating. Who planted these lies? We don't know yet, Vanessa admitted, but it's already in the media. Clara closed her eyes for half a second before exhaling sharply. All right, she said, steel creeping into her voice. They want to play dirty? Fine. She turned to Vanessa. Call David Reynolds at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Tell him I need every scrap of evidence they have on Whitmore's businesses. If they want to fight, I'm going on the offensive. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. You're leaking information? Clara met her gaze. I'm showing the world who he really is. Meanwhile, in his cell, Whitmore drummed his fingers against the table, his expression unreadable. The motion to remove Judge Johnson was already making waves, and if it succeeded, he was home free. His new judge would be someone hand-picked, someone he could control. The cell door opened, and Crawford stepped inside. You might have a problem, he said, dropping a folder onto the table. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. Oh? Johnson's team is leaking your history, Crawford said. Not just your financial dealings, the bribery, the offshore accounts, the intimidation tactics. Whitmore's smirk faded. People are talking, Crawford continued. The prosecution might even use this against us. Whitmore leaned back, a muscle twitching in his jaw. So what? He said smoothly. They're scrambling. That means they're desperate. Crawford didn't look convinced. Or it means they're cornering you. For the first time, Whitmore wondered if he had underestimated Judge Clara Johnson. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more powerful narratives like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps us continue to bring you thought-provoking and engaging content. What do you think about Maya's fight for justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for being a part of our community. Let's keep the conversation going.